it should, so that we can maintain some healthy fish populations in the Englishman and tributaries. Okay, we now have our keynote speaker. Mike is going to give us a quick talk. Mike McCulloch is a fish biologist with BC Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. His specialty, of course, is anadromous fish. So steelhead and sea run cutthroat, Chris. He is the Western region anadromous fish biologist. And I used to work with him years ago. He's worked on the island for a number of years for us, and as a graduate of, actually an original graduate of BIU's fisheries program. So he's a great guy. He will talk to us about a very interesting study that's happening on the east coast of Vancouver Island. It will include the Englishman, and it's to determine bottlenecks that limit wild and enhanced juvenile salmon and steelhead production on East Coast Island rivers, and how it will apply to the Englishman. Mike, can you unmute yourself and jump in?
Yep, no, we should be good to go there now, Pete.
Good.
So
I muted everyone else so that there won't be any distractions from barking dogs and stuff like that. So.
Great. And unfortunately, I've now unmuted myself, so there may be distractions from a 10-year-old boy running around. We're packing for a camping trip and apparently can't find stuff. So thanks for an intro, Pete. Yeah, as he said, I've been working in this region for the province of BC for about 15 years. And prior to that, another decade working with Craig Whiteman and the Steelhead Recovery Plan Initiative. And prior to that, probably 6 or 8 years, or 6 or 7 more years anyway, working all around Vancouver Island and a portion of the Central Coast, doing various things on salmon and steelhead and trout. So a fair bit of experience. I currently live in the watershed as well, out here on K Road, behind the K Road scales. And so I live close to the Englishman River, and it's certainly close to my heart. So our agency is responsible for the trout species, and I specialize in the anadromous trout species because, of course, we have relatively few resident trout in rivers. And so I look after steelhead and their habitats, cutthroat and their habitats, and management. So the project that Pete was talking about is actually a project that I've only been peripherally involved in, and it was conceived by the BC Conservation Foundation in conjunction with the Pacific Salmon Foundation. So they came together. They had 2 very similar applications to the BC SRIF funder, and they actually asked them to amalgamate their projects and basically include the province of BC within it. And so what I've been doing is working with Jameson Atkinson and trying to basically insert our provincial interests into this larger, what is more of a federal program looking at survival and trends of survival and bottlenecks on East Coast Vancouver Island stocks, mostly of Chinook. That's how this program became, kind of got going. But we saw a really good opportunity to work with some of the infrastructure that they're going to deploy in the Englishman and use that for trout. And so I can probably answer questions on both species, but I think we'll just kind of do a bit of an overview. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so if I could have the screen, I will get into it.
You should be able to share your screen now.
All righty, do you see that?
Not yet.
Okay, just might be a second here.
Now we're good.
Great. All righty, and we should be good to go.
Yeah, we're good to go.
Great. So again, this initiative is using looking at using these kind of pit tags on a number of systems, and we'll kind of get into what this really means. A couple of objectives. So it's a multi-year program and looking at survival mortality trends. As I said, provincial interests include the trout species, so cutthroat and steelhead trout. And the kinds of things that we're interested in are things like migration timing, residence time, and survival. So basically, the building blocks of kind of good fisheries management and understanding of the species within the system. And we're only acting in a support role. So I'm not a project lead here. Jameson Atkinson with the BC Conservation Foundation and Isabel Pearlstone with the Pacific Salmon Foundation are actually the leads. Neither could attend today, so I'm basically going to attend in their spot, but also hijack this in respect to provincially managed species to some great degree. So how the program is going to roll out is that we've chosen pit technology other than other active technologies or more passive technologies. So there's things like direct observation that we could use, where you basically do repeated surveys or assessments. You can touch a lot of fish, you can try and count a lot of fish. Everything has its pitfalls, and we have a project here that's large enough that we can actually afford to do this pit tagging technology. And because a lot of the initiative is based out of federal facilities, we have access to many fish. And so I'll go into what passively induced transponder technology is in a second, but that's why that was selected. And of the rivers on the east coast of Vancouver Island, they're looking at doing the Puntledge, Big Q, Little Q, and the Cowichan is already being completed. There's a large initiative there. And it was the work on the Cowichan that basically provided many insights into Chinook survival that allowed basically the program to show great success. And now we've moved on to more systems. Now, fish capture and sampling, in a location like Big Qualicum Hatchery, when we can roll up, we can tag a very large number of fish quickly and deploy them. Like, let's say we can tag 10,000 fish in a couple of days. That's really effective and really good. And so we get a great sense using these pit tags of what the initiative, well, basically we can deploy enough tags in a federal facility quickly such that we get high quality results back quickly. The problem with working in a place like the Englishman is that we have to capture large numbers of fish. Because they have relatively low survival, we need very large numbers of fish out in order to show any significant number of fish back. And so this pit tag technology is the same technology that is deployed into like your dog's ear if they've got a little tag or radio tag that your vet can read. So we actually use the exact same tags. So there, you see them on the left here. They're about the size of a grain of rice, and they're made of glass. They don't have any batteries in them, but they have this little copper coil. So we actually have to apply a very small amount of current into the water through an antenna array. And this tag accumulates that energy until it chirps its electronic code back. So that's why it's called passive, is because they don't have any batteries and they need to be energized in order to provide an RFID code back to us. They can be deployed into fish that are relatively small, about 16 millimeters or a couple inches long. And we actually put them in the coelomic cavity of the fish using a one-time use needle. And despite all those constraints, we can do, again, thousands of fish per day, and the tags are only kind of between $1 and $2 on average. And so it's a great way to tag very large numbers. The downsides of this program are that the efficiency variability is directly related to how good your antenna is. So you have to have a really high quality antenna that's constantly sending a very small amount of current into the water, but it can't be detuned, and so it's very sensitive to the kind of the electromagnetic interference, even from things like ballast from lights in adjacent homes can actually influence it, because we just need a tiny amount of energy in order to get this result. It's very sensitive, and so when the antenna is perfectly tuned, it's very effective and efficient. But when it's not, or if a large log comes down and wipes us out, we suddenly have we can't actively track these fish at all. And so we can sometimes have gaps in the data, and that can be a problem for us. The other issue is low marine survival. And so if we deploy tags into, let's say, Chinook salmon, which might be surviving at 1 to 2%, for every 100 tags you have out, you're only ever going to recover 1 or 2 fish. And that's not a problem if you only care about seeing 1 or 2 fish, but generally, biologically, we get these kind of broad differences in run timing, residence time, and survival. And so we need to have kind of a sample size of 30 to often over 100 resultant fish in order to kind of show statistically a valid result, which is, when do these fish return? Well, if you only get 1 returning, you never know whether that's an early one, a late one, or a normal one. And so a species that actually is really well suited to these tags are cutthroat trout. And so cutthroat trout return, or rather they're kind of made in small streams. And so within the Englishman River watershed, as we look at the kind of 20 plus kilometers of anadromous water, of that, there's only 4 or 5 high quality kilometers for cutthroat trout production. And within that 4 or 5 kilometers, there's perhaps 1 or 2 key kilometers of cutthroat trout production. Most of that we feel is centered in Center Creek. Some of it, however, is distributed in small systems like Shelley Creek. And so I know that you guys have a fence on Shelley Creek, and it actually provides us an interesting opportunity to handle some of these out migrants and deploy tags into them. So rather than a 1 or 2% marine survival, these cutthroat trout smolts probably have maybe a 10 to 30% survival because they only go out for a year or 2 prior to returning to spawn. And so that allows us some really interesting insights, because these are fish which use the system more broadly. And so by that I mean they can leave and then come back episodically throughout the first 1 to 2 years in order to feed and move around in the system. And so those are insights that we have difficulty getting in any other way without direct kind of monitoring. And so the problem with cutthroat is that we can survey and we can swim, and you see them all the time everywhere. And so it's very difficult to determine where the key times are, how long those fish are in stream. And if one was just using observational data, you might say, well, they reside in river because I see them in river regularly every month of the year. Or you might say that the adults return to spawn in kind of the fall because we see them following salmon migrations up and they're in spawning kind of condition or pre-spawn condition. But the simple reality is that they have a high fidelity to their rearing natal stream locations like Center Creek, and that they just simply are really good at finding food and forage within the watershed, both in the lower river and in the middle and upper and headwaters. And so we see these interesting and dynamic patterns of use. So with enough observations, we understand, and through the scientific process, we understand pretty conclusively where these fish are using and what their patterns of activity are. But by deploying pit tags into them, we can help quantify that use. So we get a sense of how long these fish are in freshwater relative to saltwater, and some specific patterns, perhaps even to the system. And so again, basically these fish are going up places like Center Creek, probably in January and February. They're spawning in the early spring. The fry are emerging in the late spring and early summer. They're rearing for a couple of years and then they go out. So they're rearing for 1, 2, or 3 years, probably 2 or 3 years in these systems. And then they're going out like again, the fish I'm holding there in the lower right hand of the slide. So they're basically between about 10 and 20 centimeters long when they leave. And again, have this relatively high survival. Of course, they need high survival because these smolts are relatively infrequent. So we only see something like between tens and hundreds of smolts per watershed or per subbasin. And in total, we might only have perhaps 100 to 200 smolts coming out of individual watersheds like Shelley Creek or like Center Creek. And so we're talking about a relatively small habitat base to support them, and we're talking about relatively small numbers of smolts. This is a cutthroat trout from the Englishman River. So these are really beautiful fish. This fish is almost 50 centimeters long. In fact, I think it was actually just over 50 centimeters long. So a really great example of what one of these adult anadromous cutthroat trout looks like. Because of all these concerns around their limited habitat base, water use, limited productivity based on small stream size, and low smolt production, they're a species of management concern for us. And so this is where we see a great overlap between some of the species that we have concerns with in the watershed and this project, which is now going to have this infrastructure in place, this antenna array on the bottom, and basically an unlimited access to tags, and maybe even working with local groups like yours in order to deploy these passively induced transponder tags into fish. So we've got this incredible opportunity to work with a species that we wouldn't normally invest the effort and time into based on their low numbers to derive some really good insights. And so, as I said, the threats to these populations are, they include habitat degradation and disruption. Past forced harvesting has seriously influenced some of these channels. And of course, urbanization specifically influences these small streams more than large main stems. So as they go through farmers' fields, they're of a size that they can literally be put into ditches and regularly are. And they can be influenced in a relatively large way with subtle impacts. So some other times when we've been sampling on the Englishman, we encounter species like this. This is a resident rainbow trout. So most of the rainbows within the Englishman are actually an anadromous form. They're steelhead. And they are steelhead because they have access to the ocean, and the ocean is a great place to grow. And so, but from time to time, we encounter these resident rainbows. There's perhaps, dozens to maybe low hundreds within the watershed, probably not even low hundreds, perhaps 100 in total. And so in a place like the Thompson River main stem, you would probably find several hundred of these per linear kilometer of stream because it's a very productive place. The Englishman is less productive, or rather the marine environment is so much more productive that it selects away from this resident form. So it's always interesting though when we tag these fish, because in some cases they can be up to 5 or 6 years of life in stream, but in some cases they just might actually decide to leave and jack or come back after 1 year in the ocean. And so these are kind of odd forms that we don't normally get to study and look at. And by deploying tags into these kinds of fish, we get a better sense of their migration beyond the antenna array and back. And so how you guys can help with this initiative. So I've just really skimmed over, like very briefly, kind of what they're up to. But I see a really good intersection here. I mean, I've worked with Faye extensively in the past when we were doing the kind of recovery initiative for the Englishman, the Pacific Salmon Foundation sponsored initiative. And I'd love to work with you guys in the future. And I think this is a really awesome opportunity because of this really expensive infrastructure that's going to be deployed into the Englishman. It affords us this kind of really a unique opportunity to work on species which we wouldn't normally in that in anadromous cutthroat trout and steelhead. So the fish capture for these species can be really laborious and time consuming and time sensitive. And so with the BCCF folks, the BC Conservation Foundation, they're going to be working on 5 or 6 watersheds on the East Coast, and mostly on coho and Chinook salmon. And so for them to try and track down kind of the week, for instance, of peak migration for a species like cutthroat trout is going to be very difficult. And if we just kind of work along the margins of some of these systems, or if we try and even sample large numbers of coho, because let's say our sample size might be 5,000 coho for the Englishman, we can probably fairly effectively get that at like the side channel fish trap or fish fence. And within that time where we could get 5,000 coho, we might actually only sample dozens of cutthroat trout. And so if we can actually extend the number of sampling locations and the time of sampling, we have an opportunity to sample perhaps many hundreds of cutthroat trout smolts, as well as some steelhead, which are also produced from those same side channels. And working with folks like you who are already on the ground, we can then get into sampling significant numbers of fish, which then yield kind of more knowledge and better results. And so I'm calling those pathways of discovery, and those pathways of discovery can ultimately inform fisheries management in ways that, we feel like we know a lot about these systems, but every time I've really done a deep dive and investigation, we discover really unique and cool things about these subpopulations. And we'd encourage participation to learn with, well, we'd encourage your participation to learn with us. And so we feel like you guys could be a better steward with more knowledge, and we then can use that knowledge for better management. And so we feel strongly that that we can actually work together and have better outcomes. And so that's, I think, how you guys can help us and this larger initiative. Is insofar as the dollars and cents, it's a fairly expensive program over a number of watersheds that includes 4 to 5 different biologists and technicians working with the BC Conservation Foundation. I can't really speak to budgets and how they might be able to help support your work, but I feel strongly that I could be an advocate in facilitating enhancements in your budget, and certainly where we need additional infrastructure and where they can kind of, because we've got such a perfect opportunity here to have some dollars tied with a community group that wants to work within the watershed, I mean, I would certainly push very hard and have as much influence as I could to ensure that provincially managed species, that small streams are included within this work, and that we simply just don't focus on large federal facilities and only Pacific salmon. So I guess that's my pitch. And I'd really like to have an interactive discussion with you folks about the kinds of work that you're doing in the future, and what you'd like to do, and whether you feel like you could work with us on this initiative.
Thanks a lot for that. Just a side note to my co-hosts, I've lost the audio portion or the video portion of the Zoom call, so I'm going to log in with someone else. So Barb, can you unmute people? And I'm going to log in with my other device so that if you can add me as a participant when I come in. And note to everyone that if you wanted to raise your hand or just have a question, then you can just push your space bar to unmute yourself temporarily.
You know what, I've actually got a couple other items, I guess, only partly related to this initiative. So the Englishman River has been selected as the East Coast Vancouver Island Steelhead Stock Assessment Indicator Stream. And so I've got a very small pot of funds that we annually invest in steelhead stock assessment on Vancouver Island. They include watersheds like the Gold, and we survey the Heber for summer steelhead, Sitka for summer run steelhead. The Cowichan, we do an electrofishing program for winter run steelhead, and the Englishman is the only East Coast Vancouver Island stream, which is of a suitable size where we can actually do underwater direct observations, so snorkel surveys on steelhead, and we do 2 to 3 a year and have done so for at least the last 20 years. And so I use it as kind of a key indicator for steelhead stock strength and health for East Coast Vancouver Island, and actually manage a whole number of systems in part related to what we observe on the Englishman River. So it's a really important system for us from a steelhead perspective as well. And so we're going to continue to monitor those. So we use both electrofishing and direct underwater observation snorkel surveys on the Englishman, and we'll continue to do so in the future. Any questions?
So, sorry.
I have a quick question. Has there been any studies being done on the health effects of these tags on the fish, but also on potential predators?
Yeah, and so the federal program is basically looking at bottlenecks of marine survival. And so the federal facilities allow us a good opportunity to go in and tag up to about 20,000 coho smolts. And so they're released. And one of the real challenges with this passive technology is that you can release fish, never see them again, and you have no sense of what caused that mortality. You only get a sense of survival. And that's a really common thing in fish science. I mean, until you send out a $5,000 satellite tag, which we're actually doing in some watersheds this year, you can't get a sense of what actually ate your fish. So with very expensive technology, you get a sense of like the internal temperature of the animal that ate your fish. And so it's great, but hyper expensive. And so one of the other interesting studies though, is that we felt like seals were having a differential and significant influence and impact on salmonids on the East Coast Vancouver Island. And so we actually fitted seals with a detector for these tags, as well as an accelerometer. So they had to wear a hat, which basically allowed us to understand when they ate our fish, or the provincial federal species in this case. And so what we discovered was using the combination of accelerometer and remote antenna, mobile antenna that was literally moving around on the animal. We got a sense of where these smolts were being eaten by seals. And so in some cases, there were really great patterns, direct patterns of observation, which led us to understand the challenges associated with seals and their local influence and impact on species like coho on the Big Qualicum. But again, the real issue is when these fish don't come back, you don't get a good sense of mortality. It's one of the reasons why species like cutthroat trout that actually have a relatively high survival rate are a great candidate species for this technology. And species like Chinook that have a low survival rate, you simply have to deploy thousands and thousands of tags, of which you get, some hundreds or tens back. And you're always on the margins of kind of biological significance there.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question, Bernard?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, and, another kind of interesting thing with survival or mortality, I guess, directly on the Cowichan, we actually had really low in-stream conditions in one year, and they saw that there was some predation by herons. And so what was interesting is that we didn't actually understand how to measure that or monitor it. And we just thought, notionally, maybe those herons are having a pretty significant influence. So what they did is they took a pit tag scanner, basically a mobile array, and they walked around underneath the heron rookery. And it had never been done before that they had monitored the presence of these tags under these rookeries. And of course, the thing just lit up. They sampled hundreds and hundreds of their tags, which were eaten by herons and then defecated out of the nest. So at the base of these rookeries, they were able to walk around with a mobile array and say, we had a massive influence in that one year. They're actually doing the same thing on some seal hollows, where they actually have pit tag arrays on Cowichan Bay that are actually at the hollow locations on log booms. So as the seals climb onto the log booms, we're actually passively monitoring what's in their gut. And so in some cases, they're seeing really large numbers of these tags in their guts as well. And those are observations of which, again, we understand we have large scale mortality at many different trophic levels. It's just very hard to quantify that because there is such a large amount of dispersed mortality. Some of it's kind of compounding, some of it's just one-time mortality. And so much of it just goes undetected. So this allows us some interesting insights. I don't think we're going to be doing those same studies on the Englishman. They're really time consuming. And again, you need to have tens of thousands of tags out in order to rationalize, in order to find these tags spread across the landscape. It's really difficult.
Yeah. So to come back to my question, so these tags, just when they're being eaten, they just pass through the system and there's no harm to the predator or the fish itself, right?
Yeah, that's correct. These are glass encapsulated, very small tags. And so they don't biodegrade, unfortunately, but they're very small.
Oh, okay.
And so, yeah.
Can you use those tags again?
So, no. I mean, the bottom line is they come with a needle. Actually looks like this. I'm not sure you guys can see this. So this is actually a deployment gun using this one-time very, very sharp needle. And so I can put this right into my hand here. Oops. And so I see this is what the tags look like here. And so because this is a one-time use needle, just the value of sterilizing these things, and they also, they're never as sharp as you used the first time, and they're so cheap, they're only $1 each. Also from a data perspective, if we get multiple fish that come alive again and then do different things, that becomes challenging. And so, yeah, we view these as one-time use.
Okay, my only other comment is that your slides are grammatically superb.
I don't think you were looking hard enough.
No, I looked. They're very good. Very good use of English grammar. No errors that I could see.
Unbelievable, literally, for me.
Mike, you can tell who our editor is.
Yeah.
Mike, it's a very good presentation. Thank you very much. You identify that that there's already a program going on the river for steelhead with the swim surveys and that's the BCCF swims and the electrofishing in the summertime.
Yep.
That will continue.
Yeah. In fact, we're going to use every opportunity that we have where we have these fish in hand to actually deploy more tags. And so we will probably continue and maybe even expand slightly the PAR assessments with electrofishing. So again, one of the key challenges is that steelhead smolts are made by many hundreds or dozens of fry that eventually winnow down into ones of individuals which are kind of strong enough and successful enough to survive.
Right.
So if we start tagging fry, we have such a large attrition that we have to deploy thousands of tags into fry in order to get even ones of adults back.
Yes.
Because at every trophic level we lose, or at every biological level, we lose many, many fish. But we're going to use that electrofishing as an opportunity to deploy more tags into candidate fish, so fish that are kind of like 60 to 80 millimeters long. And then we also get a sense of what overwintering survival is on those fish. And so we often guess, and I think our guesses are kind of within a pretty tight range of confidence, but we can inform those guesses now with this science. And so we would never install a multi-$100,000 array in order to kind of calibrate our guesses. But in this case, we have an opportunity to work with the existing infrastructure. And so it's a great opportunity for us to use those electrofishing surveys to actually deploy more tags, maybe expand the electrofishing surveys to deploy more tags. And again, ideally working with local groups like yours, if technically feasible, to, let's say, put an installation into a system like Center Creek, which we know is perhaps the most significant and important cutthroat stream in the watershed. And through, single installations like that, perhaps touch hundreds or even thousands of fish in total.
That's actually my next question was, there's really supposed to be only one array on the river.
Yep.
One pit tag array that's supposed to be down below the Orange Bridge somewhere.
Yep.
So you think that that we may be able to push within the budgets of this program to have some smaller arrays in other locations?
I think that's totally feasible, Pete, to do smaller arrays in other locations. They can't be the primary array. I mean, we need to be basically having full containment. It's a really large piece of infrastructure. I've actually built arrays on the Englishman myself for next to nothing. And in small streams, if you can actually have a relatively safe, in quotes, safe location where you don't have large wood coming down, like Center Creek, for instance, we could actually put in arrays into that system. And you have to be thinking long-term with these studies, right? As far as if we deploy an array into if we deploy tags into smolts, it's going to be a year or two prior to us seeing the first adults back into the system. And so this study it was a 5-year initiative. We've now been winnowed down to 4 years because of COVID delays. And I just looked at their work plan, and they're looking at putting in the main installation in July of 2021.
Yeah.
And so we suddenly see like the timelines for deriving good information in the core program are limited. But I think what they're hoping is that we might be able to maybe pass off some of this infrastructure to groups that want to continue to keep it rolling. And from an agency perspective, we'd really be willing and able to maybe take data that are collected more passively and analyze it, to store it, archive it, and analyze it into moving forward into the future. And so we'd probably consider this something like a 5 or 7 or 10-year initiative, perhaps even get 2 steelhead life cycles out of it, or maybe 3 cutthroat life cycles out of it, just in order to kind of tighten up some of the variables and to see the differences between years, particularly is really interesting for us. So I think it's a good opportunity to have infrastructure. They probably won't even want that infrastructure back. So in other words, the arrays that get dug into the bottom of the Englishman River, somewhere along, below the Orange Bridge, I don't think that they're going to want to, if they could pass that off to someone else, I think they probably would and allow us to use it into the future.
Oh yeah.
And so it's a great opportunity to work with this into the future, right?
So one last quick comment would be, one thing that we've done in the last few years, Mike, is we've gone to the biology department or the fisheries and aquaculture folks over at VIU to get an honors student to kind of help us manage the data and actually report out on the data on a regular basis. when you get volunteers, we're great at collecting data, but somebody's got to analyze the stuff.
Yep.
So is it possible to bring that kind of those students into this kind of thing?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the technology is, I mean, it's great. It's really intriguing. It's actually pretty simple. I mean,
Yes.
you download a very simple kind of device, and it spits out a bunch of times, basically dates and times and tag numbers to you.
Right.
And so the data is actually not wildly complex to work with. It just takes a lot of kind of digging, and it's actually a perfect kind of student project. Also, I mean, in the springtime, as I've already said, you know, unfortunately, these fish don't kind of come out in dribs and drabs over 3 months. They basically barely come out over 3 months, and then in one weekend, normally a weekend where everyone's busy, that's when they all decide to pile out.
Right.
And so, you know, students may or may not be really suitable for that kind of work. We need a kind of a core team, I think, of individuals, volunteers, willing and able to touch and who really want to be out in the wilds, you know, doing some valuable work. And then, unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, if you've got a high quality data set, I think it's easy to find students. You know, if you went to VIU and said, hey, look, we've got a long-term initiative, we've got some interesting data, some of it may be difficult or complex to manage. I don't see that you'd have any problem getting a student on board to say, hey, look, grind through this. And if, you know, if you come up with a null, something that's null, it doesn't really matter. If you come up with kind of a gem in there, that's great to know.
I've got a question, Mike.
Yeah.
You were saying though that this equipment has to be really fine-tuned, and it kind of goes out. It can go out of sync or something. So you would need. How difficult is it to keep it fine-tuned over, you know, 5 to 7 years?
Yeah, so I mean, if you can imagine, when we've done this in the past, it's been a very, very simple installation. So I basically pounded in aluminum pickets into the stream substrate, and then literally had an extension cord that went across the stream, down, and then back across. And so if it got twisted, or if there was too much debris that loaded up on it, it would go out of tune. I believe the infrastructure that they're going to deploy now, and so that infrastructure cost me about $250 in material and 1 day of time to install. The infrastructure they're going to deploy now is actually buried under the substrate. And so it should be very, very good. If they select a high quality location, I suspect that they'll be testing it for RF interference. And assuming that it's a high quality location without a lot of interference, it should actually go pretty well. Now, if you wanted to have like a sub deployment in a system like Center Creek, it would take maybe a day of time or a couple hours of time for a biologist to show up, do some efficiency testing, and maybe tweak the system a little bit. And that could happen maybe once or twice a year, 1 or 2 days a year. And that's the kind of support that I think, you know, a specialist would do. So that would be the BC Conservation Foundation guys. And again, based on, you know, the influence that we have within the initiative, I'd say we can make that happen. I mean, if we want to work with a group like yours in order to maximize the efficiency of an antenna array that's already out there with tags that are deployed, I think it's really easy to basically say, hey, look, we need a couple of days of your time per year.
Yeah, I think that would be actually critical to have that kind of quality control.
Absolutely.
To get the best data, yeah.
I mean, the other challenge with remote sites and is that if you can plug this into a 110 socket, it's really great. But there's almost no place where you can plug in to 110 and have no interference. And so we even thought that some of our interference was coming through the 110 lines. Like there's a bunch of kind of black magic stuff here. But in a system like Center Creek, you actually often use batteries. And the battery deployments are really good because they're very clean. And so there's no RF interference out in the woods. And so you actually often get really high quality antennas. And we currently have one on like the Big Qualicum River, for instance. And it functions almost perfectly, almost flawlessly. And it only takes a couple of days of effort per year. We get some really great data from it. So it's the technical aspects, I believe strongly, will be managed by the BC Conservation Foundation, their bios and techs.
Okay.
Anybody else? Questions for Mike?
Hey, Bruce, are you showing me a new fishing spot there? What's going on?
Where'd you go?
Bruce.
Maybe we don't want to know.
Yeah. So the idea though is to piggyback primarily on the bottleneck assessment survey that BCCF are going to be initiating within the Englishman watershed. Would we need to have additional funding sources to assist in the kinds of small kind of add-on project that we're talking about? Do we need to go somewhere else to find some funds?
I don't think so. No, I think the kinds of valuations we're talking about in order to maximize this infrastructure are really small. And so the exact investment per watershed is unclear to me insofar as like the real dollars and cents. I know in the first year they have something like $500,000 for infrastructure alone. And so I would envision things like batteries and cables and reader chipsets and all the tags. That's all going to be taken care of. And so I would think that if even if it was a relatively small contribution for things like fuel to get up to a place that would demand, you know, a truck like Center Creek, those are really reasonable things to expect. And even a per diem per day, you know, again, I can't really speak for the project management team, but I mean, from my perspective, I'm really gonna emphasize the value of these data and particularly the remote locations. And so all we can do is basically push pretty hard on and kind of see where we go. Again, I'd really love to see systems like Center Creek being monitored more actively. If it is truly tertiary to their needs, then we'll have to maybe look at a small grant. We've worked with the Freshwater Fisheries Society of BC recently with their native trout initiative.
Right.
And so they give up to about $5,000 grants for native trout projects. And that would be one that I think we could easily tap into, or we should probably attempt to tap into. And if we needed some support like $5,000, I think, or up to $5K, that would be one I'd go to and be probably a pretty high likelihood of success on that. So no onerous proposal writing is what I'm saying, Peter.
You got it. So it's Isabel and Jameson that you're. Is that the? Is there a kind of a core leadership group that are part of this program?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they're the signatories to the contractual arrangement, right? So the BC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund has issued a contract to the BC Conservation Foundation and PSF jointly. Actually, I think maybe it was PSF directly, and then BC Conservation Foundation is the prime contractor. And within that structure, Jameson is currently the project manager and will almost certainly be the project manager through the duration of this initiative. And so working with Jameson would be, I mean, necessary. And I'm basically working as a technical advisor with Jameson around some of the provincially managed species.
Well, I've got a question, Mike. You may have answered this before, but do you have other stewardship groups helping you out in this program?
So at this time, we don't. So you would be the first stewardship group. It's a new initiative. And so the contract was just signed this last spring. And then again, quickly, we scrubbed this year's objectives around because of, you know, due to COVID and concerns there. I would, this is probably the only watershed that I've got an interest in kind of monitoring provincial managed species this closely. And so in the Big Qualicum, for instance, we do have a system in Hunts Creek that produces anadromous cutthroat trout smolts. I think the array is going to be placed in an odd location there relative to our monitoring. It could be right at the hatchery facility. And in places like the West Coast, we're going to look at tagging steelhead out of Robertson Creek Hatchery. But we're able to work with these big federal partners in order to achieve our objectives on those waters. So this would be one of the few watersheds, I think, where we have this kind of group like yours, a stewardship group, which is really well placed in order to kind of help facilitate maybe even significant components of the project.
So when would you need to hear back from us on this?
Well, I think it's going to be iterative. And so one of the things that the BC Conservation Foundation guys might be able to do is if they see that they want to meet these specific objectives around cutthroat trout, they will probably contact you folks around what you're already doing within the watershed, and also with the community advisor with DFO. And so if you guys already have opportunities to touch some fish at some times, if that sample size is going to be big enough for us, and I've already looked at your data on Shelley Creek, I think certainly we would take that opportunity easily to sample cutthroat trout out of that watershed. But if you wanted to expand it, it's then a function of what their budgets are, what their rollout's going to look like. And there's just simply a lot of uncertainty at this time until they really get into it, until they deploy their main stem arrays. We have basically inserted ourselves consistently into this initiative as the province of BC, and we were told to do so. And so I'm really kind of curious about some of the results, and now it's a function of how we kind of can distribute the efforts on the ground to meet these objectives and how much we actually need to do in addition to what's already being done. And so I think I probably want to work with someone like Peter or any member of your group moving forward to talk about, you know, the art of the possible here. And so from you guys, I guess I'm just kind of broaching this as a kind of really great opportunity. If you can action it, if you actually have the kind of technical capability, i.e. manpower, people on the ground, and you could see how we can support you in order to make that judgment in relation to, you know, a per diem or a fuel or whatever that may be. And if we can come to some kind of reasonable agreement, I think that, you know, moving forward, we can scale this up kind of probably significantly. So I would say at this time, we'd like to work with you based on your programs that you have ongoing now. And then moving forward, if we can expand those programs, that would be great.
So that's what Jameson Atkinson, the BCCF biologist, he made contact with me back in April to potentially piggyback on the Shelley Creek fence project, which I guess it was April, early May, so it was too late to really do anything. But they're very keen about that activity that we've been involved with for over 10 years, coming in and assisting in potentially tagging off of our site. How that works, I'm not too sure, but to actually get into working on Center Creek, which has always been of interest to us, and focusing some more attention to it, I think is certainly from my understanding over the last, you know, in our directors meetings, we talk a lot about Center Creek and our need to get back to be active in that system. So I'm kind of optimistic that we can work out some activities that will be beneficial and help. I just worry a little bit about the communication links and not having to go through you know, a board of no, not our board, but you know, a group like Jameson and Isabel to try and get them to be interested in some of the activities that we would have on this smaller project. So Mike, if you're our contact, then that would be good.
Yeah, no, I can easily say that that I'll work directly with Jameson in order to make this happen for your group, and can be your primary contact. I think he's going to be really busy, and again, I know the watershed well, and And again, I live in the watershed, so if things went sideways, I could be at that site as well in, you know, half an hour or less.
You're a bear for punishment. Anybody else? Questions? Okay. Mike, that was great news, and we will probably at our first board meeting discuss our approaches to moving forward with this.
That'd be great, Pete. Also, I mean, feel free to include me wherever feasible to help understand to the best of my ability. Again, I've kind of been a little vague here, and not entirely unintentionally, because again, I'm not spending the dollars. So as we get more clarity on this, as we get infrastructure in place, I strongly suspect that we'll get more partners or more interest when this becomes a real project and initiative. And then we can kind of see more opportunities unfolding in front of us. And I think there'll be a lot of interest building here. So we'd love to work with you guys in the future, and look forward to that opportunity.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
I'm off to Tofino, so I'm gonna leave you, and have a good meeting. And thanks for doing the watershed here as well. It's always appreciated.
Thank you. Bye now.
Cheers.
Okay.